Greetings to all of you, my dear friends. You may call me Raven, and welcome to a tale of worlds beyond imagination. With this being the first video on this channel, I was puzzling over what kind of story I wanted to do to start things off, and I thought, well, if I'm going to be releasing something on this of all days, Halloween itself, I thought, well, it has to be a very, very appropriate story. So today we are going to be diving into one of my personal favorite spooky stories. It is a story of mystery and intrigue and perhaps a bit of a supernatural flair. I am talking about, of course, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This one has always been very fascinating to me, and I do hope that all of you who will join me today will take great enjoyment out of it. So, without further ado, let us enter into that small town on the banks of the Hudson River, where the legend of a particular specter is said to haunt the local populace, and what happened there to the man who was known as Ichabod Crane. On the eastern shores of the Hudson River, there lies a small market town. From the peaceful nature of the place and the very odd character of its inhabitants, the town has long been called Sleepy Hollow. An odd lethargy seems to hang over it, and indeed to pervade the atmosphere. The townspeople are given to all kinds of strange beliefs and see very strange things, as well as hearing music or voices in the air. The town is filled with local stories, haunted places, and superstitions. There is one spirit over all that haunts this region and stands dark in the minds of all the town. The apparition appears as a figure on horseback without his head. Some say that he is the ghost of a soldier who lost his head by a cannon shot in some battle during the Revolution. Forever after, he now rides the country in the gloom of night, riding at speed along the road, especially in the vicinity of a certain church. Scholars in those parts allege that the trooper's body was buried in the churchyard, and he rides forth to the scene of battle in a quest for his missing head. The strength of this superstition is so strong that it has furnished many a wild story in that region of wind and shadow. Around country fires, the specter is known as the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow. Presently, to this strange and dreary place came a man by the name of Ichabod Crane, a schoolmaster from the state of Connecticut. Crane was very tall but exceedingly lanky, with very narrow shoulders and long arms and legs, which gave him some of the appearance of a scarecrow. He looked at you with large, glassy green eyes, and his nose was quite long and sharp, reminding you, perhaps, of a rooster perched upon a weather vane. The schoolhouse was a low building with a single room. During the vacant hours, it was secured by a switch twisted into the door's handle and with stakes set against the window shutters. With his pay as the schoolmaster, Crane was not a man of much means. When the school hours were over, he could often be seen, boarded and lodged, in the home of those farmers whose children he taught. This was all according to country custom. In this way, week after week, he would make his rounds of the neighborhood with all his effects tied up in a handkerchief. To pay back this kindness, the schoolmaster would also assist in odd jobs around the farmsteads. Ichabod had a great appetite for the strange and the marvelous, and held quite an extraordinary ability for digesting it, which had only been increased by his time in Sleepy Hollow. There was no tale too monstrous for him. Often it was a delightful pastime, after the school was dismissed, to stretch himself out by the stream that whispered by the schoolhouse and think over these dire tales until the dusk came. Then, as he moved his way through the woodland towards the farmhouse where he happened to be that evening, every sound in nature at that dark witching hour moved his imagination. The whispering of the whippoorwill, the cry of the tree-toad, the hooting of the screech owl, even the fireflies, which shone most brightly in the shadowed places, would occasionally startle him. Another source for his frightful pleasure was to pass long nights with the old wives of the town as they sat with their knitting and listened to their great tales of ghosts and goblins and haunted fields and brooks and bridges, and particularly of the headless horseman, or the galloping Hessian of the hollow, as they sometimes called him. He would delight them equally well by his antecedents of witchcraft, of omens, and pretentious sights which prevailed from Connecticut in earlier times. But whatever pleasures may be gained while behind doors in the ruddy glow of a wood fire were quite dearly purchased by the terrors of his walk homewards. How often was the man appalled by some shrub covered in snow which was in his path, and how often he shrunk with awe at the sound of his own step upon the ground, and how often was he thrown into a complete disarray by some howling through the trees, so taken was he by the idea that it was the horseman himself. All these were only terrors of the night, phantoms that walk in the dark. Crane had seen many specters in his time, yet the daylight put an end to all of this. He may have passed a pleasant time in Sleepy Hollow, despite certain evils, if only his path had not been crossed by such a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole race of witches put together. And that was a woman. Among those who made the acquaintance of Crane was the fair Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of the wealthy farmer Baltus Van Tassel. She was rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and held universal fame not only for her beauty, but for her great expectations. Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart for women, and soon enough Katrina found a great favor with him, especially after he visited her home. Baltus Van Tassel was quite content in his wealth, and did not look beyond the boundaries of his lands. As Ichabod fancied all of this, his heart and soul yearned for the one who was to inherit them, the beautiful Katrina. The schoolmaster endeavored now only to gain the affection of this dear maiden. In such an enterprise he had more difficulties than what had befallen a knight of yore, who dealt with giants, enchanters, dragons, and the like, only to walk into a castle keep and there find his dear love. Ichabod, on the contrary, had to win the heart of Katrina, and encountered a host of adversaries from her many admirers, who kept a watchful eye on each other. Among these admirers, the most formidable was a burly man by the name of Abraham, or simply Brom Van Brunt. He was a hero of the surrounding county, which always spoke of his great feats of strength. Broad-shouldered, with curly black hair, he carried himself with an air of fun and arrogance. For his size and strength, he had gained the nickname Brom Bones. By this he was universally known. He held great skills and knowledge in horsemanship, and he was always ready for a fight or for a frolic. For all of his roughness, there was a good humor under it all. He had several companions who considered him a model, and they would travel the country, attending every scene of merriment or feud for miles around. This local hero had for a long time singled out Katrina as the object of his gallantries. Many whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hope. Of course, his advances were signals for any rivals to retire, as they had no wish to cross one such as he. And when his horse could be seen tied up at the Van Tassel home, it was a sure sign that his master was courting within. Such was the nature of this formidable rival with whom Ichabod had to contend. A less stout man than he may have shrunk from this competition, but the schoolmaster held a perseverance in him, and though he might bend beneath pressure, the moment it was removed he would stand and carry his head high. To engage his rival openly would be madness, for Ichabod was not a man to be easily thwarted in this affair of love, so he made his own advances in a more quiet and gentle manner. As well as schoolteacher, Ichabod was the master of singing. Under this mantle, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. By this plan, he carried out his own suit of the fair Katrina. Soon after this, it was a rare sight to see Brom's horse tied on the Van Tassel property, and a dangerous feud grew between him and Crane. Brom Bones would have carried matters to war and come to blows in order to settle things by a combat. Of course, Crane was all too conscious of the man's superior strength, and so not such a fool as to go against him. He had once heard a boast from Bones himself, saying that he would double the schoolmaster up and leave him on a shelf in his schoolhouse, and so Crane was wary to give him a chance. This left Brom with no alternative but to play practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became an object of certain whimsical persecution by Bones and his gang. They harried his favorite haunts. They smoked out his school by stopping up the chimney. They also broke in at night and turned everything topsy-turvy. The poor schoolmaster began to believe that all the witches in the country must hold their meetings there. Even more annoying than all of this, Brom Bones took every opportunity to turn Crane into a great object of ridicule when in the presence of Katrina. Things went on like this for a long while without seemingly having any effect upon either party. Then, on an autumn afternoon, Ichabod sat on his stool in the schoolroom. All his students were intent upon their books. The quiet was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a young lad in a jacket and trousers and mounted upon a horse. He came rushing up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a frolic to be held that very evening at the Van Tassels. Afterward, all the students were hurried through their lessons, and those who were very nimble skipped over half of them. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Benches were thrown down as the whole school was turned loose a full hour before the usual time. Now, the gallant Ichabod spent an extra half-hour at least brushing and furbishing his best and only suit of black, and combing his hair at the mirror in the schoolhouse so that he might present himself in true gentlemanly style. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was lodged, an old man by the name of Hans Van Ripper, and, once mounted, issued forth like a knight in a quest for adventure. In the true spirit of the romantic epic, I must explain some of the look and equipment of this great hero and his steed. The mount was a broken-down plough horse which had outlived most everything except its viciousness. The horse was very gaunt, with a head like a hammer. His mane and tail were knotted. One eye had lost a pupil and looked quite spectral. The other eye held the gleam of a devil. Still, he must have held a fire in his day, if we could judge by his name of Gunpowder. Even broken down as he seemed, there was more of the devil in him than any young colt in that country. Ichabod Crane was quite the suitable figure to match his steed. He rode with short stirrups, bringing his knees nearly to the pommel of the saddle. His elbows stuck out like grasshoppers, and he carried a whip perpendicularly in his hand. As his horse moved, the motion of his arms was similar to a pair of wings. A small hat rested at the top of his nose, and his black coat fluttered nearly to the horse's tail. It was a fine autumn day, and the sky was clear and serene. The trees wore the cloth of the season, in colors of brown, yellow, orange, and scarlet. It was closer towards the evening when Ichabod arrived. He found the home thronged by many people, older farmers in homespun coats and breeches, and their wives in long-waisted gowns, younger maidens who carried some mark of city innovation, such as a straw hat or a fine ribbon, the men in short coats with great rows of brass buttons. The hero of the scene was, of course, Brom Bones. He had come to this gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, an animal much like himself, being full of mettle and mischief. None but Bones himself could manage him. The man was known for preferring vicious animals who were given to tricks, and so kept the rider at risk for his neck. Brom believed that a tamed horse was unworthy for a man of spirit. As Crane entered the great parlor of the Van Tassel home, he beheld a great table set out with all the abundance of autumn, many different sorts of cakes and pies, as well as ham and beef. There were also many fruits and nuts as well. Quite happily, Ichabod did great justice to them all. He was a very kind and thankful man, and his spirits rose in good cheer with the food. He chuckled at the possibility that he, one day, may be lord of this scene. Baltus Van Tassel moved throughout the room among all the guests, full of good humor, as he shook hands, slapped shoulders, laughed, and told everyone to help themselves. Soon enough, the sound of music from the common room summoned all to dance. Ichabod Crane prided himself very much upon his dancing, as well as his powers of singing. To see him there, clattering about the room, people might think some divine patron of dance was there himself. Katrina herself was his dance partner, and she smiled graciously to him as Brom, sore with jealousy, was left brooding alone in a corner. When the dance finished, Ichabod was brought into a knot of the older townfolk, including Baltus Van Tassel, who sat at one end of the room, gossiping over old times. Many of the storytellers embellished with fiction and made sure to make himself the hero of the story, of course. It is true that local tales and superstitions thrive best in places like Sleepy Hollow, as if there were some contagion in the air that gave an atmosphere of dreams and fancy. Several of the older generation were present at the revel that night, and, as usual, they were telling their wild legends. The chief story among them all was turned upon the very favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who, many said, had been heard of late patrolling the country, and tethered his horse every night among the graves in the churchyard. The story was immediately matched by a great adventure of Brom Bones, who laughed at the Hessian as an errant jockey. He said that, returning one night from a neighboring village, he had been overtaken by the horseman and had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch. He would have won it too, he said, as Daredevil beat the horse hollow. But as they came to the church bridge, the horseman had bolted and vanished in a great flash of fire. All of these tales, told in that quiet way that men speak in the dark, sank deeply into Ichabod's mind. He repaid them, of course, with many marvelous events which had taken place in his home state, and the fearful sights he had seen in his walks about Sleepy Hollow. The revel gradually broke up. The farmers began to gather their families, and the sounds of laughter and the clatter of hooves echoed among the woodlands. The happy scene was eventually quiet and deserted. Only Ichabod remained behind, in the hopes of sharing a moment with Katrina. He was convinced that he was on the road to success now. What happened then is unknown. Suffice to say that the man left with an air quite desolate. Perhaps he even wondered if her encouragements had been false in the hopes of securing his rival. He hardly noticed the scene of wealth around him as he moved to the stable and roused his horse, none too kindly. Time had crossed into the witching hour as Ichabod Crane began his travel home with a heavy heart. All the stories of ghosts and goblins he had heard that day came crowding into his mind. The night grew even darker. He was approaching the place where many of the stories had been discussed. In the center of the road here stood an enormous tree, which towered huge over the other trees and formed a landmark. Its limbs were narrow and large enough to form full trunks of ordinary trees. The town people held it with a mix of respect and superstition, due to the many tales of strange sights concerning it. As Ichabod drew near, he began to whistle. Nearer still, he thought he perceived something white hanging in the tree, so he paused. But he saw it was only a place where the tree had been scarred by lightning. And then suddenly, a moaning came, and Ichabod shivered. But it was only the movement of one branch upon another as they swayed in the wind. About 200 yards away from the tree, there was a stream which crossed the road. Rough logs served for a bridge. Oak and chestnut trees stood where the stream entered the wood and threw a dark gloom over it. The place had long been considered haunted, and many of the school children were frightened to pass it alone at night. As Ichabod came to the stream, his heart began pounding. He summoned up his courage, gave his horse a kick, and attempted to move briskly over the bridge. But instead of moving forward, the horse made a lateral movement and ran broadside. Ichabod, whose fright increased with this delay, jerked the rein towards the other side and kicked with the other foot. It was all in vain, as his horse began, it is true, but only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles. The schoolmaster now laid both whip and heels upon Gunpowder, who dashed forwards, snorting, but came to stand still, just near to the bridge, with a sudden jerk that nearly sent his rider sprawling. At that moment, a tramping by the side of the bridge caught Ichabod's ear. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the very margin of the stream, he saw something huge, misshapen, and towering. It did not move, but seemed gathered in the dark, like some monster ready to spring upon him. The hair stood up on the back of his neck. What could he do? It was too late to turn and run. And besides, what chance did he have to escape a ghost or a goblin or something which could ride upon the wind? Summoning up a show of courage, he demanded, "Who are you?" He received no answer, and so repeated his demand. Still there was no answer. Once again he kicked at the stubborn Gunpowder, and, closing his eyes, he began to sing. Just then the shadow began to move, and with a bound stood in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark, the figure could now be glimpsed somewhat. He appeared to be a horseman, of very large size, and mounted upon a strong black horse. He simply stood on one side of the road, moving along on the blind side of Gunpowder. Ichabod, who had no wish for such a strange companion, and thought of the adventure of Brom Bones, now hurried his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. This stranger also quickened his pace. Ichabod pulled his horse to a walk, thinking that he would lag behind, and the other did the same. Ichabod tried to resume his singing, but he could not utter a single note. There was something in the silence of this companion that was terribly mysterious. This mystery was soon accounted for. Upon mounting a rise, which brought this traveler into great relief against the sky, huge in height and covered in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck to see this man was headless. But his fright was increased upon seeing that the figure's head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. His terror rose to a desperation as he rained kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping that by sudden movement he could escape. But this spectre stayed with him, and away they rushed, stones flying and sparks flashing at every single bound. Ichabod's clothes fluttered through the air as he stretched his body over his horse's head in the eagerness of the flight. Now they reached the road which turns off to Sleepy Hollow. However, Gunpowder, who seemed possessed, made an opposite turn and plunged downhill on the left. The road here leads through a sandy hollow where it crosses the famous bridge, and just beyond it lies the church. Yet the panic of the horse had given his rider some advantage in the chase, but only as he got halfway through the hollow, the saddle girth gave way, and he felt it slipping. The man seized it by the pommel and tried to hold firm, but he just had time to save himself by clasping Gunpowder around his neck when the saddle fell to the earth. His pursuer was just behind him, and unskilled as he was, there was much to do to maintain his seat. He slipped sometimes on one side or the other, and sometimes jolted with such violence he feared he might be cleaved in two. Up ahead, the trees opened, which cheered him, in hopes that the bridge was near. He could see the walls of the church under the trees beyond. He recalled the place where Brombone's competitor had vanished. If I can only reach that bridge, Ichabod thought, I will be safe. He heard the black steed rushing just behind him, and even thought he felt hot breath Another kick, and Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the planks and gained the opposite side. And now, Ichabod looked behind to see if his competitor were to vanish, according to rules, in a great flash of fire. Just then, he saw the pursuer rising up in his stirrups, and in the act of hurling his head towards him. Ichabod tried to dodge this missile, but it was too late. It struck his head with a tremendous crash. He fell headlong into the dust, and Gunpowder, the great black stallion, and the rider passed by in a great whirlwind. The following morning, Gunpowder was found, without his saddle, with the bridle under his feet, quietly cropping at the grass at the gate of his master. Ichabod made no appearance at breakfast. The dinner hour came, but still no Ichabod. The students assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled about the banks of the stream. But still no schoolmaster. Hans Van Ripper now begun to feel uneasy about Ichabod. An inquiry was sent out, and after diligent investigations, they came upon some traces. At one part of the road leading to the church, they found the saddle trampled into the dirt, the tracks of hoofs deeply dented in the road, and at great speed, which were traced to the bridge. Beyond the bridge, on a broad part of the stream where the water ran deep, was found Ichabod's hat, and near beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The stream was searched, but no body was discovered. Hans Van Ripper was given all his worldly effects. The books and furniture of the schoolhouse belonged to the community, of course. Those personal books and writings of Crane were consigned to flame by Hans Van Ripper. Whatever money the schoolmaster may have possessed, he must have had about him at the time of his disappearance. The mysterious event caused a great deal of speculation at the church that following Sunday. Many people were gathered in the churchyard, at the bridge, and the place where the hat and pumpkin had been found. Many of the old legends were called to mind, and when they had considered them all and compared them with the symptoms of this case, they all shook their heads and came to the conclusion that Ichabod had been carried away by the headless horseman. As he had been a bachelor, and in debt to no one, nobody bothered any more about him. The school was moved to a different place in the hollow, and another schoolmaster hired in his stead. It is true that an old farmer who visited several years after, and who was told the story, brought home intelligence that Ichabod Crane was alive, only that he had left the town, partly in fear of this apparition, and also the dismissal of the heiress Van Tassel. He had changed to new quarters in a distant part of the country where he kept school and studied law, where he turned politician and was eventually made into a justice of the court. Brom Bones, shortly after the disappearance of his rival, wed the beautiful Katrina. He always carried a knowing look when the story of Ichabod Crane was related, and he burst into a great laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some townspeople to suspect that he knew more of the matter than he chose to tell. The old country wives, however, maintain to this very day that Ichabod was spirited away by some supernatural means. It is a favorite story, told in the neighborhood around the winter evening's fire. The bridge, more than ever, became an object of great superstitious awe, and that might be the reason why the road has been changed in later years to approach the church by a different way. The schoolhouse was deserted and fell to decay, and it was said to be haunted by the ghost of the schoolmaster, and the young lad moving homewards on a summer evening has often thought he heard his voice in the distance singing a tune among the tranquil solitude of Sleepy Hollow.
Such a great story. Such an amazing, really fun story. I've always loved this one just for the atmospherics and the whole feeling of it is such a classic. Well, my friends, that will be the end for this video. Thank you so much for joining me, and I do hope that many of you will return to the Wordwood with me next time to see what other surprises might await in the shadows of the wood.